So let's take what we know about modifying a parametric primitive to a polygon object and modifying its components. Let's take advantage of that workflow to be able to build a more organic carrot. Now, I have my carrot, and it's just about the proportion that I want. It's in the position that I want, but I do want this to kind of be a little bit more organic in that I don't want a real straight cone. I want it to kind of zigzag as it heads out. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to select my cone. I'm going to copy it. And because I want to do some modeling, I don't want to be distracted by the rest of the objects inside my scene. And so what I'll do is I'll temporarily change scenes. And I'm going to choose File, New. So I'm just creating a new blank document. And I'm going to edit paste the cone object that I copied from my original snowman scene. And I'll tap the S key. And what that does is that gives me an environment that is free of distractions, and I can just kind of focus on this model. There are ways in our project file, in our snowman project, to hide everything, and we can use layers or we can just individually hide the objects. But for now I want to stay focused on just being able to model this object. So instead of layering too much information, I'm going to use this technique, and I'll use this often. And in fact, if I need to experiment with a tool or a different kind of shape and I want to see how it works, a lot of times I'll just create a new document, I'll throw some objects in the scene and start playing with some tools just so I understand the workflow, and then I'll go back to my project and implement that pipeline. And so that's what I'm trying to do here. So I've pasted my cone. Now, remember, in order to see the segmentation of this object, we need to go to Display, and we need to change to one of the views that include lines. So I'm going to go to the Display pull-down menu, and I'm going to choose the first one that I see that says lines. And once I do that, I can see all of the geometry that makes up this cone. Now, this object is a little more complex than I want. It's got a lot of geometric information in it. And the general rule in 3D modeling is you want just enough information inside your model, or just enough resolution, or just enough segmentation to be able to create the shape that you want. When in doubt, err on the side of a little less geometry. And there are several reasons for that. The more geometry an object has, the more taxing it is on the system to render it. This is still a pretty simple shape, but more importantly, the less geometry we have, the fewer variables we have to control and to select and to modify. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tap the S key, and that'll allow me to zoom in a little bit closer on this object. And I'm going to modify the segmentation. So I'm going to go over here into the Attributes Manager. And at this point, instead of modifying the radius, I'm going to go down here to where it says segmentation. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to modify the height segmentation. Now the height, according to the cone, is this long segmentation. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And I think I can get away with a little bit less segmentation. So I'll just take that down to about 6. Now where we're creating a lot of geometry is in the rotational segments. And so I'm going to take that down. And I'm starting off with a value of 36. And just so you know that any one of these fields, any one of these numeric fields in Cinema 4D can receive some simple math function. So what I could do is I could just key in a value, but I could also type in /2 or divide by 2 and hit return. I end up with the value of 18. And I have a lot more less geometry inside my cone object, or my soon-to-be carrot. And so that's a really valuable thing. A lot of times I'll want to add segmentation to an object, and maybe I'll want to double it. And if I want to double it, I could just use the asterisk key, 2, and then hit enter, and then I get the value that I want. So a lot of times we can just kind of eyeball things, we can do some math, or we can use very specific numbers. So now I have the cone, I think, to where I want it. And it's okay if this feels a little abstract or a little clumsy. The more time you spend modeling in Cinema 4D and creating objects, the better understanding you'll have of how much geometry you need inside each of your objects to make the shape that you want. And I think it'll become pretty apparent once I start modifying this, how useful this will be. So the next step is that I want to make my object editable. And I can do that, again, by making sure that the object is selected and going here to the Make Editable button. You'll notice that when I roll my mouse over here, I get a tooltip that pops up, and down at the bottom of that window it says the shortcut is C. In other words, if I tap the C key on the keyboard, I get the same result as pushing the button. So I can tell that this object is no longer a parametric primitive, but is a polygon object, and there's a couple different ways I can tell that. I have the object selected, and if I look in the object manager, I see that it now has a polygon icon instead of a primitive icon, a parametric primitive. And also, if I look down in the attributes manager, I no longer have the ability to control the object parameters. So I lose that ability. And then also one last visual cue is if I look over here, I can no longer make this object editable because it already is. Once that object has been made editable, I want to go over into point mode. So I want to change into the component mode of the object, and I want to go to the live select tool. The live select tool is a really valuable tool in that, depending on what component I have, I can just click, and I'm currently clicking and dragging, and now I can start to roll around the object and make a selection. Now there is a little bit of a glitch here in that, and I'll use the polygon mode as an example. If I click and drag across that object, it looks like I have the whole thing selected, but watch what happens when I move it. And I'll Command Z to undo. If I orbit around this object, try that again. If I orbit around this object, you can see that I only selected the visible elements. Okay, so when I'm looking over here and I make a selection, whether it's points, edges, or polygons, I'm only selecting the elements that I can see. We can do different kinds of selections. If I click and paint around and I want to complete this whole loop selection, what I can do is I'll hold down the option and I'll click and drag and I'll orbit around this object. Now I'll hold down the shift key and I'll continue to click and drag to complete that selection. Now I'm pretty sure that I have the entire loop here selected of points, but I'll just kind of look around and I see that I'm actually missing one. And you'll find out pretty quick once you start to move these. Obviously I didn't get that entire selection, so I'll Command Z to undo, and I'll shift click, and I'll paint around, and I'm pretty certain that I got the selection that I want. I'll go back to more of a default view. Now my goal is once I select this loop, what I can do is I can pick it up, and I can push it over a little bit, and I'm not so concerned with the direction that I'm moving it, but you can see that I'm starting to get this zigzag that I'm looking for. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and make another selection. And I'll click and drag and paint around. Okay, and I'll option click and drag. I'll hold down the shift key and I'll continue to click. Now this is a pretty precise way to make your selections. We can just continue to orbit around the object, make sure that we have everything selected. And I think I got everything that I want. And I'll just take that and I'll move that over a little bit. And maybe I'll move it down a little bit. Okay, and I'm kind of exaggerating this quite a bit. But again, I'm starting to get that carrot shape that I'm looking for. There are other ways that we can make selections using the live select tool, or more sophisticated strategies that we can use to create this kind of selection. One technique would be if I split my viewport, and again, I'll just go up here and click on this top right button here, and I'll go, let's say, to the right side. This will give me a nice profile, and I'll tap the S key, and whatever I have selected will frame to view, and I'll just use my mouse wheel to back out. So I can see the carrot, and I get a nice flat profile of the carrot. And so if I were to make a selection, if I click and drag, I get half of the selection that I want. That's a nice clean selection, but I can look at my perspective viewport, and I'm still missing the other side of the object. Well, if I select the live select tool, or if the live select tool is the last thing that I clicked on, I can go down into the attributes manager and I can modify the way that this tool works. And if you look here, there's a field that says only select visible elements. And if I uncheck that and I turn that off, now if I go back and I make a selection, and I'll click and drag that same selection, you'll notice that in the perspective viewport, it selects all the points all the way around that object. So by turning off only select visible elements, we can select all the way through an object. And if we're looking at a nice flat view, like something like this, and I click and drag, I'm pretty certain that I got all of those points around that object selected. Now, be careful, because if I go into polygon mode here, and I forget that I have only select visible turned on, I'll just navigate back here, and I try to make a selection. I'm trying to select those polygons. That looks like a pretty good selection. I can see that I accidentally caught one over here. But then when I go look around the backside, I can see that I made a selection through the object, and because of my perspective, I selected everything directly through that object. Not at all what I want to do. So if I turn on or turn off only select visible elements, I want to make sure that I toggle that, use it for what I need to, and then turn it back on. So again, here's the workflow. I'm going to go back to the live select tool and click on that. I'm going to turn off only select visible. I'll jump into a nice flat view. I'll make sure I'm using the right component mode, and I'll click and drag. Now once I release that, I got a nice clean selection over here, and I'll just borrow the perspective viewport to make that move that I want. And that's a pretty good selection. One final way that I could make this kind of selection without orbiting all the way around the object or without messing with the live select tool, and I'll just make sure that I reset only select visible elements so I don't forget to turn that on and make a sloppy selection later. There's another way to make a loop selection. If I go up under the select menu and I choose a loop selection, that's a special kind of selection. A loop selection will select in a direction of segments all the way around an object. And in this case, this is a really great way to make a simple loop selection. And I'll zoom in here so you can see this a little bit more clearly. The way that this is working is that if I roll my mouse over an edge, and that it'll make a selection of whatever component mode I'm in. So I'm in point mode. If I roll my mouse over an edge, in the direction that that edge is running, it will select all of the points around that edge. So I'll just roll my mouse over that edge, click, and now I've selected all of the points in that loop. Okay, now if I roll my mouse over the horizontal and click, you see that I get a very different selection. So it interpreted this as a loop. So I'll just roll my mouse right back over the edge. I'll make that selection. I'll go back to the move tool, and now I can continue to modify that. So that is select loop, and again, it's a way to select points around an object. So experiment with those different methods. I feel like my caret, it looks pretty good. I mean, in terms of the modeling that I wanted to achieve. Now, if I were to copy this object and try to paste it back into my snowman scene, that would be an effective strategy. The only thing I got to be careful of is I'm still in the component mode, so I'm still selecting points, edges, and polygons. So I got to make sure that I go back to the model mode of the tool. So I'll just click on this icon right here, this cube icon, and I'll default back to my move tool. My cone is selected, so I can Command C to copy. I'll go to the window pull-down menu, which in this will give me access to any open document that I have, and that's fairly universal. That's the case for any Adobe application. Cinema 4D supports it at all, Microsoft applications. So if I click on window, I can see what I have open, and I'll just go back to my snowman project. This cone was for placement. I'll delete that. That was the cone that I copied and pasted into a new document, and now I'll paste my new cone, which I think looks a lot better. Looks more like a caret. And again, it's pretty well exaggerated, but that's kind of the look that I'm going for. So I'm fairly happy with that. In the next presentation, I'll make another pass and talk a little bit more about textures, and we'll apply a slightly more sophisticated texture for the caret, and we'll continue to refine our snowman scene. So we'll catch up in the next presentation.